Well, it's great to be here, and we'll be kicking off our morning panel. And what's the Jesus? And I want to get into just first of all, we've got some cards going around. If folks have questions and want to write those down, that'll just help us collect everybody's thoughts and questions and most effectively get those answered as we get into the discussion. And so my name is Cassandra Ogren. I want to introduce the panelists. I'm coming here from the Service Employees International Union, and so I think this panel is just a really valuable space to start as we're really talking about, neo-fascist labor policies in the global north, to really name what we're seeing happening right now and sort of how the extent to which this is really the culmination of sort of progressively intensive attacks on unions, and especially unions in the public sector, and really get into the impacts that that's had on workers in higher ed and K through 12 organizing in Florida, the impact that that's had, on the history of public sector collective bargaining in Florida, and then really calling the question about, what does it mean as we're seeing this, authoritarian sort of right-wing vision of labor in this country being raised up and advanced, to the in service of this administration. So that's really where I want to kick it off, as we're really thinking about, again, the impacts that this is having as we were sort of seeing this shift from, restrict unions, make them smaller, make them less effective. What are the tools to do that, to really just straight out destroy them, which is the moment that I think we're seeing, and really learning more about what are the strategies that unions have had to fight back against that, and how unions have had to really shift, and to what extent it potentially gets members more engaged, what that means, and where we go from there as we're seeing these attempts to sort of redefine the Republican Party as a party of workers, and how we can really engage in that and look forward. So with that, I want to dive in because we want to give everyone time to present. So we're going to hear first from Jordan Scott with Florida State, talking about public sector bargaining in Florida, politically institutionalized repression and the undermining of public sector unions in Florida. So I think that'll give us a good background history, what we've seen, from the 60s to the present. Then we'll turn it over to Robert Casanello and Katie Rainwater, and coming from University of Central Florida and Florida International University, and hearing about this from right to work to no right to exist, Florida public education sector unions in an age of authoritarianism. And we will wrap with Kit Smemo from UCLA, getting into the return of the labor front, neo-fascist labor policies in comparative perspective. And look forward to hearing from all of our speakers and then turning it over to questions and conversation from there. So I will turn it over to Jordan.
Let's see, how does this work? Yes, hi, thank you. All right, so my name is Jordan Scott. As Cassandra said, I'm from Florida State University. I live in Tallahassee, Florida. I spent about 2 years as an AFSCME member when I worked for the Division of Retirement, as the secretary of AFSCME Local 3037, which is the state workers union there, which is one of the main unions that's been affected by SB 256, which we'll talk about here today. And now I'm with Florida State University Graduate Assistants United, and I am a delegate and president of what I got the shirt here, the Big Bend chapter of Northwest Florida Federation of Labor, small and mighty. In any case, so this is the title slide, Public Sector Collective Bargaining. I did want to just take some time and we discussed it as a panel. All of the panelists here want to show solidarity for students at CUNY School of Labor and Urban Studies who are fighting for basic protocols to keep students safe from ICE and for democratic mechanisms for decision-making on campus. And we thank them, the students here, for the work that they do. And we're trying to do that on our campuses as well. So I'm talking about politically institutionalized repression and the undermining of public sector unions in Florida, 1968 to 2023. This term, politically institutionalized repression, which I'll get into, is a term that I'm playing with. If people know of other terms that are already being used in the same way, please feel free to tell me. I'm not trying to invent a new term, unless I have to. The main argument here is that although Florida is unique in having public sector bargaining guaranteed in the state constitution, there's only 5 other states that have it guaranteed in their state constitution, and none of those are in the United States Southeast. It was initially set up as a weak institution and was gradually weakened over time. As it was weakened, it became less effective, and therefore public sector unions became less effective, limiting their tactical options and ultimately setting the table for an existential threat like Senate Bill 256. And Senate Bill 256, just to give you a little bit of information, was a bill passed in 2023 in the Florida legislature, similar to what you might know about Act 10 in Wisconsin, which made it more difficult to create and maintain public sector unions. It created a barrier of 60% that you needed to reach in order to maintain your collective bargaining agreement. If you don't reach it, you have to go through this really sort of grueling process of collecting cards, which then lead to another election, and it's draining on resources. And I mean, I think that Katie and Robert will get more into what the effects of that have been. And I just want to say that this is part of my dissertation project, a broader dissertation project on political power in Florida. So politically institutionalized repression, as I'm using it, stands for institutionalized repression as a form of repression where formal political recognition is combined with weak legal institutions, leading to a slow drain or denial of resources through legitimized practices. And this renders challengers ineffective. Basically, what you're talking about is they make something legal, collective bargaining, i.e. they institutionalize it, then they pass laws to make it weaker, and the challengers essentially end up frozen, committed to the power that they've been granted while simultaneously being afraid to challenge for more. They don't want to go outside of the box because if they do, they're afraid of losing the rights that they've been granted. And it's really interesting how Florida got to the point where they got public sector bargaining, because like I said, Florida is the only southeastern state in the United States that has guaranteed public sector bargaining in the state constitution. Most southeastern states don't have public sector bargaining at all, or they don't have any guaranteed right, or they have laws restricting it completely. In 1968, an interesting thing happened where teachers in Florida who were underpaid and the students were not receiving enough funding for their schools, they decided to go on strike. And there's a long story that came up. There was smaller strikes, individual strikes, and then Florida became the first state in the entire country to have a statewide teacher strike when 35,000 teachers simultaneously resigned their jobs. I know one of these teachers who went on strike. She's in our labor council, and she's a lobbyist for the National Organization for Women and the Florida Association of Retired Americans, and she's been a labor leader. She would hate that I'm up here calling this a strike. She tells me all the time, she says, "We didn't go on strike, Jordan. We just all resigned at one time." And I say, "Well, Barbara, most people consider that a strike." In any case, now, whatever they considered it at the time, now in state law it's written that if simultaneous resignations is considered a strike by state law. So whether it was at the time, who knows? And it lasted about 3 weeks, and it led to an influx of new spending on education and increased salaries for teachers. At the time, state teachers were paid at about, they were the 22nd ranked teacher pay in the country. It got it up to about 13th. That's the highest that it would ever be. So simultaneously, we're talking about how do we get public sector bargaining. It wasn't until 1974 that a law was passed that legalized officially public sector bargaining in Florida. But this led to teachers recognizing themselves as workers. The Florida Education Association, much like the National Education Association at the time, considered themselves a professional organization, not a workers' organization. Then you get the split with the AFT, which is the more radical teachers and things, you know. But anyways, so you have these sort of splits, but at this time, Florida teachers are starting to consider themselves workers. And simultaneously, you have the federal courts that are coming down and telling southern states, you know, Jim Crow southern states, you're going to need to have some changes to your constitution, because at the time, the Florida Constitution was based on the 1885 Constitution, where legislative seats were based on geographical area rather than population. So they had to go in and reapportion the legislature, which gave sort of urban progressives a little bit of power to push for some changes. And eventually the courts came in through different court cases and forced the Florida legislature to pass a bill that would go on to legalize public sector bargaining in Florida in 1974. So there's three important characteristics of the Florida public sector collective bargaining. You can see right here on the left panel here, I have the actual constitutional Article 6, but it guarantees the right of public sector employees to collectively bargain. But in the same constitutional act, it proclaims Florida as a right-to-work state and restricts public sector strikes. So you're getting all this in one article, and this is why sometimes if you talk to labor people in Florida and you're like, why don't we just take out the part that restricts public sector strikes out of the Constitution, they're a little bit dicey because they say, well, if we try to do that, they might just go for the whole article. Or why don't we take out right to work? Well, if we do that, they might just take out the whole article. You know, there's a debate about that, I think, in Florida among labor leaders and rank and file members. But this creates sort of different challenges that we're facing while bargaining collectively in the public sector. And beyond that, usually, because most states that have public sector collective bargaining have some sort of restriction on strikes, but usually the trade-off for not having strikes is having something called binding interest arbitration, so that if there's a disagreement at the bargaining table, some sort of neutral magistrate will come in and make a decision about what is right and what is wrong, and then the parties have to abide by that. But in Florida, that's not how it works. Instead, if they will sometimes go to a neutral magistrate. If they decide, something, and they decide on the side of the employees, then the employer can kind of just say, well, we don't agree with that, and do what they want anyways. So you get an idea of what we're dealing with. So that's where we were at in 1974. Since then, there's been, and I think that Robert and Katie will also address some of maybe even more that I will address, there's been chipping away at public sector bargaining. There was an article written by labor lawyer Suzanne Sanos, who calls public sector bargaining an illusion. I'm not sure if I would go that far. I think it's certainly better than the alternative not bargaining. But, for instance, there is a legal clause that allows public employers to unilaterally declare financial emergency with no justification to change a labor contract. This has happened in some municipal and county labor contracts. And again, there's no binding arbitration. In 2001, Governor Jeb Bush passed Senate Bill 2001 called Service First, which eliminated seniority, moved employees out of the bargaining unit to at-will employment, increased management discretion over compensation. And importantly, it allowed the governor to bypass any sort of moderation in collective bargaining disputes over wages and send it straight to the legislature. And if you know anything about Florida, the legislature, particularly at this time, was turning deep Republican. And you'll know that at this period in time, prior to, you might expect as a state worker a reasonable cost of living adjustment or some sort of small bump to keep up with inflation. But by this time, you see a deep cut in wages overall for state workers. And then a recent law eliminated the ability for higher education for faculty to take discipline and termination grievances to arbitration. So what is the grievance process for if you can't go to arbitration? And this has been the results, and this precedes SB 2023, SB 256. Despite constitutionally guaranteed collective bargaining rights, according to the National Education Association in 23-24, the average Florida teacher's pay was ranked second to last in the country, only ahead of Mississippi. And the state workers, Florida has the lowest ratio of state employees by population, read that as overworked, and also the lowest public payroll expenditures by resident in the country. That's their average in Florida is $40 per resident, while the national average is $95. And, you know, there's other effects to this kind of thing, too. This, least amount of state workers by population. NPR reported in August 2020, among, growing unemployment around COVID, and, quote, amid staggering job losses in March and April, Florida's unemployment system was the slowest in the country to process claims. Residents described nightmarish experiences as they tried to get benefits. By April 20th, just 6% of Floridians who applied for unemployment benefits had received a check. Less than 10%, and I don't know that that number ever got above 10%. And this affects us when we're organizing. When I used to organize for the state AFSCME Local 3037, people would say, well, yeah, when I get a raise, sure, I'll join the union. And it creates this vicious cycle. People won't join the union because they want a raise. Well, now we're not going to have enough union members to go pressure the state legislature. We're getting no raises. And, it ended out when we came to SB 256, we had a very low density. And this is what I'm talking about. So when SB 256 came to the table, unions faced off the state legislature and the Republicans with weakened unions and limited tactics. That Service First bill that I was talking about, passed in 2001, transferred 16,000 positions, state work positions, from the state workers bargaining unit out of it. And talking to an old-time union member at the time, he told us, when they made that law, they essentially eliminated half of our active union members overnight. And by the time I got there, they were under receivership, and it was honestly a mess. And so what the Florida AFL-CIO does do is called Working Family Lobby Corps, where we bring labor union members from across the state to lobby the state government. And to be honest, it's pretty effective in certain ways. They'll tell you at the legislative session this time, they stopped a lot of bad bills. And in fact, they stopped SB 256-like bills, a number of times dating back to 2011. But when the Republican Party had a 2/3 majority and DeSantis was determined to punish the Florida Education Association, there was no real recourse. There were no strikes. There were no major statewide protests. And even like what happened in Wisconsin, there was no large-scale occupations of the Capitol. We simply, asked our legislators, please don't kill us. And ultimately, they decided to do what they wanted to do. This is just an example, and this is part of my dissertation. I'm not getting into here today, but the Freedom Foundation sent out cards to all of the union members to encourage them to drop out of their union, and they were involved along with ALEC and Americans for Prosperity in pushing this bill. And finally, ultimately, public sector collective bargaining rights started out weak and got weaker over time. I refer to this as politically institutionalized repression. Unions used a sophisticated insider game strategy to fend off or weaken SB 256-like bills. for close to a decade. Still, once the legislature gained a 2/3 Republican majority, they were able to push the bill through. As a result, over 50 union locals have been decertified. Actually, I think y'all might have calculated over 100. Many more are expending resources to hold certification elections, and the labor movement as a whole has lost significant funding. The glimmer of hope is that some workers, including workers that have been decertified at Florida A&M University, are rebuilding outside of the confines of collective bargaining. Thank you.
Oh, yeah, can you pull mine? Okay, perfect, thank you. All right, good morning. So as we've seen in 2023, DeSantis's supermajority Republican legislature passed SB 256. This was Koch network authored legislation which banned payroll deduction while simultaneously introducing a new requirement that 60% of the bargaining unit be dues-paying members in order for unions to achieve annual recertification. And so journalists have reported that under this legislation, more than 68,000 workers have lost collective bargaining rights as more than 100 bargaining units have been decertified. So Robert and I are both members of the United Faculty of Florida, and we're both in unions that were with densities well under 60% when this law went into effect. So we had this kind of perspective of how it was playing out within our union, but we wanted to understand a bit more broadly. First, this law felt like really new and unprecedented, but was it? So we're asking, does SB 256 represent a break or continuity in how the state relates to public sector unions in Florida? And second, how are public sector unions faring under this new law? So our first argument is that the state of Florida has always been interested in constraining unions' power, but there has indeed been a shift in how the state relates to public sector unions. So we argue that there's been this move from right to work to what we're calling no right to exist. And under what we're calling the right to work era, the state recognizes public sector unions as collective bargaining agents, but diminishes their efficacy with regulatory mechanisms such as the right to work provision, a no strike clause, impasse procedures that heavily favor management, and restrictions on the scope of collective bargaining imposed by the state legislature. However, under no right to exist, all of these conditions continue to prevail, but what's new is that the state is using its regulatory power to decertify public sector unions as collective bargaining agents through the erection of onerous requirements for their continued recognition. And so to better understand the impact, we looked at public sector unions in the education sector. Unions in Florida are not wall-to-wall, and so workers under a single employer are typically divided into different bargaining units. And so, we found that the impact of SB 256 has been really bifurcated. For a minority of education sector bargaining units, 33 of the 245 total bargaining units, or about 13%. The no right to exist era state has indeed succeeded in using its regulatory power to decertify these unions as collective bargaining agents. And in this way, 16,000 education sector unions have lost the ability to collectively bargain. And so, for example, on the slide, we see SEIU's Faculty Forward initiative, where all 8 of the adjunct faculty unions that existed at the beginning of the period have been decertified. But for most public sector collective bargaining units, like nearly all the units represented by our merged NEA-AFT affiliate, the Florida Education Association, which is the union that about 167 bargaining units are affiliated with, they're surviving and remaining certified as collective bargaining agents under SB 256. And in this way, the kind of no right to exist era state and the new kind of density requirement and is essentially functioning like a right to work era regulatory mechanism in that it's weakening unions by draining their resources. And indeed, we see that FEA has lost about 15% of its membership and, you know, considerable dues under SB 256.
All right. Thank you. I'm gonna.
I'll be back.
All right. I'm gonna just go through these slides because Jordan went over a lot of this stuff, and I don't want to repeat it. Okay. So here I'll pick up at the passage of SB 256, which you've heard both from Jordan from Katie earlier, and what I want to go back a little bit because what's sort of missing here is like there really were early attempts at this no right to exist style of legislation, let's say. And back in 1979, the legislature passed a law impacting public sector unions, and it did two things. One is it required unions under 50% to register with the state annually, and it wasn't like as burdensome as a process as what we would see with 256 in 2023, but it did require a lot of paperwork and financial auditing for each of these unions. The other thing was it provided the ability of members in a bargaining unit to challenge certification. So it created this recertification process, but it was, and a couple years later in 1981, Florida State University and University of Florida both hosted opt-out elections because there was a handful of faculty there that wanted to decertify United Faculty of Florida. And the both opt-out elections, they barely won both opt-out elections. And so that's sort of a first attempt at the style of legislation that we would come to term no right to exist. And of course, with 256, what returns here in a much muscular way are things like the ban on payroll deductions and, of course, the 60% density requirement. I believe that was already mentioned earlier. Jordan had mentioned the recent legislation that was introduced in the Florida legislature, which did not pass. There were 4 different versions of the same bill in the Florida legislature. And what made that piece of legislation part of this growing effort at No Right to Exist is that in certification elections, I should mention what a certification election is, but if you're below 60%, if you're below that threshold, if you wanted to remain certified, you could host yearly certification elections. And so that would keep your certification going, but you get involved in getting card campaigns going, and then a certification election, and you'd have to get 50% of the votes in a certification election. And what the new legislation was going to do was going to essentially count people who did not vote as no votes, meaning that you'd have to get essentially 50% plus 1 yes votes in order to remain certified. And this is echoing Act 10 from Wisconsin that was in that piece of legislation. But it did not pass for reasons we can speculate. All right, moving on. Oh.
Yeah, and I do want to point out that one thing with the no right to exist is that before 256 went into effect, under Rick Scott in 2018, a similar law passed, but it just applied to education sector unions. So for teachers, they had to have above 50% to remain certified. But now moving to SB 256 and trying to understand the impact. So what we did is we assembled this data set of education sector bargaining units. We did remove a few units from analysis, and just to kind of save time, I won't kind of get into how we ended up creating this 245 set bargaining unit set. But I mean, this represents nearly all education sector bargaining units that existed for K through 12 in 2018 when Rick Scott implemented the 50% density requirement, but that only applied to like instructional K through 12, and then for SB 256, this is all the education bargaining, education sector bargaining units. And so what it kind of looks like is most bargaining units in the education sector are in K through 12, 176. Then you have 29 in the state colleges and 40 bargaining units in the universities at the kind of outset of this legislation. And then on the right-hand side, you can see that big swath. The majority are represented by the international NEA and AFT, right? It's a merged statewide affiliate. And then you have like a smaller percentage of workers, of bargaining units that were represented by SEIU, about 20, and AFSCME, about 32. And then there was a few represented by independent unions. And then there was about like 10 other unions that represented a handful each.
Okay, I'm going to kind of quickly go through some slides, and then Katie will come back and talk a little bit about our data analysis. So as far as teacher units, this would be K through 12, the unions that represented teacher unions across the various school systems. Only one of 67 unions were decertified, and we don't actually know the details of how this one union got decertified. We just know it was decertified based on the paperwork from the regulatory agency, and the union was the Jefferson County Education Association, which is not too far from Tallahassee. It's the next county over. Okay, and this is a graph of membership density versus the size of the bargaining unit. So what goes up the chart here is the density percentage. So you see it's from 0 to 80% density. And what goes across from the bottom is the number of people in the bargaining unit. That's not members, but the number of people in the bargaining unit. And you'll notice like the highest density is up in the the left-hand corner there. So you can see that there's a correlation between units with lower bargaining unit numbers versus the ability to get to that 60%, because the second line there is that 60% threshold. And you can see that those bargaining units out further than 5,000, they aren't at the 60% threshold. Close to, but not at the 60% threshold. Okay, non-teacher units in the K through 12 sector. This would be unions that represent like bus drivers, support staff, paraprofessionals, non-instructional workers at the K through 12 system, and 4 of 109 of them have been decertified. Okay, and this is a graph of them, same thing. You'll notice the bargaining unit's the scale here is much less, it only goes up to 7,500 total in the bargaining unit. And if you'll notice up on the left-hand side, again, you see a similar dynamic. Those bargaining units with less, those unions with less bargaining unit members have a better chance at getting at the 60% than the other unions. And you can notice if you compare this to the previous graph, the staff unions are in much desperate shape than the teacher instructional units are. Okay, and then moving now to higher ed, none of the faculty unions and none of the grad student unions have been decertified. All of the adjunct unions have been decertified, and Katie had mentioned that. And in the staff unions, 20 of 27 have been decertified. And so you'll notice that the most vulnerable here are the are the adjunct and staff unions. Okay, and here's again a chart of that. You'll notice up on the left-hand side again, we see recurring theme that the lower the number in the bargaining unit, the greater chance of moving over the 60% threshold. And that's even true in the higher ed unions that have the greatest chance of overcoming decertification.
Okay, so overall takeaways are that, of course, the adjunct and staff unions in higher ed are decertified at much higher rates than teacher, non-teacher, faculty, and grad unions. And the unions that are getting decertified, it's not simply just a matter of like, what was their density, right? Because like a union with, for instance, 15% membership density can survive, and all the grad units had a 20% or below density, but survived through recertification elections. And so kind of point two is that FEA unions certified with our merged NEA AFT, statewide affiliate, are decertified at a much lower rate than non-FEA unions, which has about like a 41% decertification rate. And so essentially like what we see is that, units that are non-instructional units that are in the same union or same like statewide affiliate as instructional units are having a greater chance of surviving. And this, could be for different reasons like solidarity or kind of fortress reasons. These unions have an interest in making sure none of their unions are decertified. And in addition, instructional units have much higher salaries, right? And so they're able to share resources with the weaker units to ensure their survival. And then the final thing we want to kind of point out is that many units are surviving through these annual recertification elections, right? On those graphs, we saw many are below the 60% density. And so that even though, the no right to exist era is not proving fatal for the majority of unions, the impact would be much more existential if legislation like that considered this past cycle does end up passing. So I just want to briefly conclude. We're a bit over time, so I'll just wrap up by saying, how are our unions responding? And I think one thing that's somewhat telling is that FEA endorsed Daniel Perez, a Miami-based Republican who's the Speaker of the Florida House of Representatives. Perez voted for SB 256, and he also voted for the Stop Woke Act and anti-educator legislation. However, FEA endorsed him after he made all of these bad votes. And I think part of the idea is that by sticking with Republicans that are the enemy of DeSantis or that make promises that they're not going to pass through legislation like that considered this cycle, our union can survive, right? But I want to ask, is this really strategic? Like, how long can these sorts of tactical alliances endure? And furthermore, what does this tell our members about the source of our power, right? I think, we have examples of education unions, the Chicago Teachers Union, UTLA, in which small groups of radicals gained leadership and moved their unions into an organizing direction. We haven't seen evidence that this kind of democratization of unions or move to an organizing model is really taking hold in Florida. But, I think that's what needs to happen to kind of, continue to survive as public sector unions in Florida. Thank you.
All right, hi everyone. Thanks for coming out today. Thanks to previous panelists, I think for setting a lot of, I think, really important contextual and empirical groundwork for, I think, what I'm going to be talking about today, which in some ways is going to get at, I suppose, maybe some more abstract elements of what are the contradictions of this moment, and particularly on the right, and particularly as the right embraces a kind of neo-fascist orientation in the United States and across the world. So what I want us to think about, and what I'd like to talk to everyone about today, are what are the kind of policy programs and what is the sort of intellectual foundation of what we could call, and certainly what certainly many right-wing and neo-fascist parties across the world have been promising as something like an exit from neoliberalism from the right. Now, what does this actually entail? It's one rife with tensions and indeed rife with some very basic contradictions that I think I'd like to talk through by turning our attention specifically to the case of the American Compass think tank. Are people familiar broadly with this? I get that a lot. I've just started this project, so also, I mean, any thoughts you have about framing and some of these more kind of bigger theoretical questions would be much appreciated. The American Compass is a relatively new think tank on the American right, founded in 2020, which I think is important to consider as itself, of course, a calamitous moment in global capitalism, and one that shook, I think, many of what we would consider to be the certainties of kind of post-Cold War logics of what it would mean to govern capitalist polities. So the American Compass it was founded by a former management consultant and former policy director for Mitt Romney's 2012 presidential campaign. It was a think tank that, after its founding, received enthusiastic and early support from many people who have gone on to leading positions now in the second Trump administration. Former Florida Senator Marco Rubio, current Secretary of State, an early advocate of American Compass. So too, current Vice President J.D. Vance, along with Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton, Missouri Senator Josh Hawley, a number of people who have begun trying to push the Republican Party to adopt what they consider to be a pro-worker position. Now, Cass specifically founded American Compass around the idea of revitalizing and building an explicitly, as he puts it, conservative labor movement. Now, what does Cass mean by this? In effect, Cass has argued that the now decades, if not maybe even century-old playbook of the American right to assert power in the workplace has been fundamentally around immiseration, what the economist Michel Kalecki famously called the threat of the sack. Right? You keep workers desperate, you keep them atomized, you can keep them disorganized. And that, in turn, is a way to ensure social control and social cohesion and profitability. Now, what Cass and the American Compass argue is that this is fundamentally breaking down, and that what is required are some kind of investments to make what they consider to be, of course, a very narrow, very restricted, highly xenophobic notion of what a real, quote-unquote, working class looks like. So they're calling for, in effect, a kind of reactionary social reproduction, something that Cass argues, and I think probably can see plenty of evidence to confirm, that much of the US right for decades has not considered those questions, right? They're about cutting taxes, slashing social programs, otherwise accelerating immiseration as a way to, again, ensure profitability and social control. So this turns on what in many ways really are perhaps what's new about this set of ideas coming out of American Compass. And its relationship, I argue, to the kind of global neo-fascism of our moment. Now, we can think of certainly fascism as certainly an inflammatory and often imprecise epithet, but I think if we turn our attention to, say, political theorist Alberto Toscano's new book, or newish book, Late Fascism, we can see that this is an ideology that has its own kind of scavenging hodgepodge of policies and policy ideas that coalesce around a violent reassertion of power and hierarchy. And so I think when we think about what it is that this kind of conservative labor movement looks like as itself a kind of fascistic program, as Toscano writes, it comes out of this idea that there is, in fact, something like a real proletarian nation that has been lost, either to immigration, to ongoing struggles for gender and sexual liberation, struggles for freedom broadly conceived. And so what I think we can see here is that it is about reasserting, as Toscano writes, a history of labor that centers on hate strikes for racially exclusive trade unions, passionate attachments to empire, chauvinism broadly conceived, anti-immigrant demands for some kind of national preference in labor markets, the reassertion of the straight nuclear family. But all of these things, of course, in one way or another, well, they cost something. And so this is the part of Cass's program that has earned certainly a lot of condemnation from other right-wing think tanks and thinkers on the right who question whether or not this program could even be considered within the mainstream of US conservatism. Because in effect, what Cass is arguing is that workers deserve a seat at the table. They need to be afforded a share of the profits generated by US capitalism. And so in effect, this calls for a variety of, as he puts it, pro-worker reforms, which I'll list briefly as a way to just get a flavor of what it is American Compass is advocating. So this includes eliminating so-called adversarial collective bargaining relationships, particularly those enshrined by the National Labor Relations Act, and replacing them with more so-called cooperative arrangements, particularly around sectoral bargaining, organizing work and workplace issues across entire industries or even entire regions. It also includes eliminating unions as political organizations, independent political organizations able to, of course, campaign behind politicians or otherwise lobby and push for policy change. And of course, more broadly speaking, democratic mobilization. It also comes with subsidies, promised to reassert the possibility for working people to reorganize themselves into exclusive nuclear families along heterosexual models. Now, this comes in the form of sort of meager subsidies, but also particularly by arguing that wages need to be raised in order for workers to afford these particular kind of familial and household relationships. And to ensure that these kind of relationships will be subsidized not through expanding transfer payments or other kind of entitlements, but rather through closed borders and escalating deportations. Mandatory e-verify, and other policies to maintain a nativist working class. The idea being that if you create a closed economy, as they put it, you'll be able to tighten labor markets and raise wages. So it's these programs and this kind of policy agenda that shapes, I argue, their fascistic orientation, something that I think can speak to the historical memory of, say, the corporatism envisioned by Mussolini's fascism in 1930s Italy, or even the Nazi labor fronts of the same period, mixed perhaps with a dash of, say, Argentine Peronism. So the tension I think that is clear here is the extent to which these are policies that, to some level, call for an organization of working people. Now, of course, a very narrow and exclusive one, and one that, of course, always is operating under the threat and the scope of expanded police powers to discipline and regulate workplaces, particularly through, of course, restricting rights of citizenship, both industrial and political. But the tension coming from the idea that there is, I think, ultimately a fear that animates Cass and the American Compass's policy program. It's a nervousness that the existing model of the right's orientation to simply breaking unions and disorganizing workers will be insufficient in the long run to maintain social control and social cohesion. One can think of various references at, say Davos, from the research panels coming out, speaking of some sort of amorphous concern about revolutionary upheaval as inequality becomes ever greater and ever deeper. But the founding of American Compass in 2020 is important, coming, of course, amidst the economic upheavals of the COVID pandemic, but not to mention the massive struggles we've seen on the streets that summer following the police killing of George Floyd, not to mention ongoing upsurges in labor mobilizing and organizing in the years since 2020. So I think that is really, the key point in understanding where these policies are coming from, and why CAS and American Compass are charting a shift away from kind of existing libertarian or Reaganite era or even Goldwater era visions of simply disorganizing workers in order that the benefits will somehow organically trickle down. They're concerned that without some investment, however meager, in the social reproduction of a very exclusive, heteronormative, xenophobic idea of a authentic working class, that working people may be on the cusp of being able to push and win far greater reforms, whether that be actually through forcing legislators to make policy changes, or perhaps winning those changes on the jobs and on the streets. So I think there is this kind of palpable nervousness that lurks behind these programs. And it's one that also, of course, only highlights and underlines the cracks and tensions within what we can see in the United States as a broader Trumpist coalition that promises, on the one hand, pro-worker benefits, but of course is in the process of dismantling certainly much of the administrative state designed and geared to reproduce working people. So I think this is, again, the contradiction, right? How could American Compass actually mobilize, or could it actually mobilize a significant assembly of forces, social or political forces on the right, or carving out defections from the liberal labor left to take this bargain as an improvement on the one that they currently face? It certainly faces an uphill battle within the right, as there, of course, is not much of a legislative bloc that's interested in any of these reforms. Perhaps there's not even much amongst the broader Republican base. I mean, one can think of the rather bemused reactions that greeted Teamster President Sean O'Brien when he appeared at the RNC this summer. But nevertheless, the fact that there is a think tank like American Compass, and one that claims support from figures as influential as they are, I think it does beg the question about what this means long term, right? What is a longer strategy for both defanging and demobilizing, if not outright crushing, right, an existing labor movement in the United States? But how does this link up with other deeper tensions about what it would mean to tackle the kind of inequalities that even thinkers who, like Orrin Cass, who I think imagines himself and understands himself to be on the center right, how this bleeds into increasingly, I think, fascistic solutions to reproduce the kind of social order that they believe has been lost, and to try to reclaim some sort of mythic social compact that has been undone in the last 4 or 5 decades. So I guess these are some of the big ideas and kind of tensions and contradictions that I'm grappling with, and I'm very curious and eager to hear from all of you. So thank you very much.
All right, so we're going to dive into questions in just a minute. I think the order we did this was actually just right, because everything kind of like evolved into your final piece. And really, as we're thinking about the history of this chipping away, making it more difficult, further restrictions, putting additional roadblocks and complications to workers organizing and retaining their unions, what we're seeing reflected today in the federal government, and then I think this, sort of performative, like fetishized image of, the American working class, and this exit right from neoliberalism is really an important space to get at what we're seeing right now. And so to back up just for a minute to react a little bit, I think the points around like who has retained representation in Florida are really important, and to get into that a little bit more. SEIU's Florida Public Service Employees Union, for example, is right now in the midst of recertifying K through 12 support staff. We represent support staff in Pinellas County, Lake County, and Palm Beach County. It's hundreds of work sites. The work that goes into under the restrictions of the new law and that institutionalized repression of getting people to sign up, both for paying dues and on a perk card to reauthorize their election. It's just kind of like one thing after another. It's very, and if you missed something, it's this very sort of like bureaucratic, complicated process that, takes a lot of work, and you've got to meet all these deadlines, and you've got to file all of these things, and you've got to get all of your members signing these cards. And so what it really leads to, and I think what you've really surfaced here, is that, for insecure, fragmented bargaining units that might not all be in one place at the same time and may not, stay in their jobs for a long time, for bargaining units that might be more low income, that might have more people of color in them, those barriers are much harder and they're much higher than, a more stable, more, higher paid groups like faculty and teachers. And so it really makes it incredibly difficult for low-income workers, for low-wage workers, suddenly having to sign up for payroll deduction that's coming from their bank account or their credit card and getting charged after they get their paycheck, creates real hardships. As opposed to when you get your paycheck, like that's it and it's all your money and you're keeping it. And so, for folks who are, working a school year, not working during the summer. And so there's all these situations where just maintaining that membership and keeping folks engaged takes a huge amount of work and resources, and really fundamentally, makes it as difficult as possible for workers who are facing other challenges. So I think that's a really important takeaway. And then ultimately really getting into, as we're seeing this and as we're seeing what this administration, what lessons they're essentially learning in terms of like taking away bargaining rights from TSA employees and, issuing these, albeit illegal executive orders to, take away collective bargaining rights overnight, and dues deduction from millions of federal employees. Where are we going with that? And what does that mean in this moment as Kit has really gotten into about all of this performative pro-labor, pro-American worker, what's the image, who's in, who's out. Scott Bessent suggested that fired federal employees can go work in all the factories that are going to spring up because of the tariffs. And so this sort of fundamentally, fetishized view of what it means to be a worker, and this also fundamentally anti-intellectual attitude and, that President Pringle got into about, what are we teaching our children, right? Amidst this, decade-long move toward restricting public sector unions and unions at every turn. I think that we are at a really serious, scary turning point of, where did we go after neoliberalism and where do we go next? So with that, this was a really great place to bring all of that together and to get, really go from the history to the current moment across this group. So I'm going to open it up to questions. We have quite a few questions that folks have submitted. So what I think I'm going to do is kind of do it a bit hybridized because I'm going to take some time to read these. So while I am picking a few out, why don't we open up the floor to maybe one question here and then I'll take one and then we'll kind of go back and forth. We've got about half an hour, so we'll keep it moving from there.
Yeah, perfect.
And then if y'all can pass your question forms to the center, whether they're blank or have questions on them, I'll come grab them.
Thank you. Two questions. First of all, Kit, thank you for your analysis. I would argue that these issues have been manifest since the 1968 campaign of Governor Wallace. And we're just thank you, Kit. I would argue that these are manifest since the Governor Wallace campaign. And my problem with the left, of course, is that I was a Teamster in the 70s. I was involved in organizing. I used to encounter these issues firsthand with people. And Bannon's actually talked about a common turn for the right wing around the world. So this has to be really sussed out. The question to the Florida people is, how do you relate the content and culture war issues that we see hitting you guys with the new college being wiped out, all these curricular sort of, I don't want to insult Ozzie and Harriet, but sort of the Ozzie and Harriet view of American history that we see imposed by these quote, reforms, end quote. How does any relate with what you're talking about?
Okay, I mean, I think, yes, we're also, facing attacks on what we can teach in the classroom, on DEI, and I think that it's come together, right, simultaneously, and I think it's just like no accident, right? Like you're taking away, and like in higher ed, we've also lost tenure, right? Teachers had restrictions put on continuing contract before under Rick Scott. But so, I think that they're making people afraid by taking away their job security, attempting to undermine unions, while at the same time trying to like take over higher ed, right? And so I think they're targeting like what would be our potential resistance movement and trying to undermine it by making it weaker and attacking at the same time. I don't think it's a coincidence.
Yeah, I think that's really, thank you for reminding us all about the Wallace campaign in 1968. And I think one thing we can see just as in that moment, as in today, Wallace's program of a kind of white chauvinist investment in, again, a very narrow white chauvinist masculine working class was of course ultimately beset by its own contradictions. Nixon tries to co-opt some of them with, say, the family assistance plan, efforts to win over elements of the labor movement with the promise of some kind of material subsidies, but doesn't go anywhere. It gets undermined by the very forces that coalesce to create neoliberalism. So I think we've seen some historical examples of this, but again, I think we're now confronting maybe at an even more another intense point of crisis about like, well, what does that mean? Is that, or is these kind of Wallaceite energies, are they going to dissipate or fragment in the same way they did 40, 50 years ago? Or are we at a kind of a breakthrough moment for something else?
Yeah, just to add a few things. In the 1970s, Lewis Powell wrote a famous memo about who hates free enterprise. And, one of the things that he said, well, it's the professors. It's the radical professors. It's the liberal professors who don't speak highly enough about free enterprise. And so for a really long time, they've wanted to come for the professors. And out of that memo, you get the Chamber of Commerce relocates to Washington, D.C. You get the Association of all the different neoliberal organizations are sort of rebuilding. They're founded in the 1970s, and they start to build this political program that becomes neoliberalism. And just a second sort of point about what's happening, particularly in Florida, particularly from SB 256. So out of the abortion laws sent back to the states, Florida is one of the states that has a 6-week abortion ban. And I think very specifically because of the pressures based on SB 256, the Florida Education Association and ultimately the Florida AFL-CIO decided not to make an endorsement to support Amendment 4, which was on the ballot this past year, which would have re-legalized abortion in Florida. And they did this very specifically because they were scared of losing their members and becoming decertified. So it's a way of sort of, and many of us, I think, disagreed with that decision. It was a very heated debate on the floor, at least in the AFL-CIO. I wasn't there for the Florida Education Association debate. It was a heated debate on the floor, but we ended up losing, and the debate was, we're scared of losing our members in our rural Republican counties and not being able to recertify. So that's something that sort of comes out of this.
So I'm going to do 2 questions from here and then back to the audience. So you're next. Just because we've got a couple groupings of questions around Florida and then around, the federal government moment that we're in for Kit. So let me do 2 and then back to the audience, and then we'll see where we wind up there. And I I'm going to merge a few together. So if we have time for follow-ups, if I don't quite capture what you're asking here, you can raise your hand too. But one of the sort of themes in the questions about what's happened in Florida really revolves around what opportunities are there for the more stable bargaining units to support those that are more precarious, that have had challenges, combating decertification. What more could FEA be doing to really raise up and rally the public to their cause? And how does that relate to, I think, what you just touched on here, this question of people voting in their own self-interest when this is all happening? And so that's a bit of a amalgam, but really raising what more can the unions with some degree of stability be doing, what's standing in the way of doing that, and what are additional opportunities that union leaders in Florida see to really advance the message effectively in this moment.
Let me, I'll start off by taking the first part of that because that's something I think about a lot. I'm a contingent faculty member in a bargaining unit that mostly represents non-contingent faculty. I'm on a visiting line, so I'm in unit, but my adjunct faculty colleagues, also contingent, are out of unit, right? So I think about this question a lot. And I think that in Florida, there's this kind of impulse right now to let's save what we have, right? And we've got to wait until every existing faculty bargaining unit is at 60% before we engage in any new organizing, right? And I will say kind of the history of this is that the sort of the founders of our union, the United Faculty of Florida, back in the 1960s, they were radicals. They envisioned creating a wall-to-wall union of all campus workers, but they hit a few roadblocks. One was that PERC said adjunct faculty couldn't be in the bargaining unit. Anyway, I'm still teasing out the rest of the history and how staff ended up with AFSCME instead of in the higher ed union, because in K through 12, a lot of the staff units, as we've seen, are in the same unit, the same union, but different bargaining units as the instructional unions, and those staff units are surviving at greater rates, right? So we have this history, in higher ed, of staff being represented by different unions, and as far as I can tell, not tons of collaboration between the different unions, and I think that this idea of kind of well, let's wait until all our faculty units are stable and then engage in new organizing is kind of problematic because we need really big coalitions among campus workers to win things. And so, I think that what we need is sort of a new vision, a new commitment to organizing wall-to-wall unions. One thing that's encouraging is that UFF recently joined Higher Ed Labor United, which has a commitment to wall-to-wall, ensuring contingent and more vulnerable workers are organizing alongside. I do think that we need to be sharing our resources, right? When adjunct faculty make $4,000 per course, it's absurd for us to say, okay, well, your dues should go to organizing adjunct faculty, and we're going to keep all of our dues money to organizing non-contingent workers, right? So there needs to be a lot of financial sharing. I think that there's these the work of Chris Boner on finance unionism and how a lot of the internationals are holding on to their money instead of spending aggressively on organizing. And I really think that Florida, if we let Florida fall, the rest of the country is likely to follow. And so I think now is a time to have a vision of what we can accomplish by bringing people together across job category and really aggressively organizing. And this is, of course, a lot easier said than done. I've been in the trenches in my own unit for 3 years. And it's like really hard to like think about where to start and like what feels like a winnable issue. But I feel like starting to get some small wins and then kind of showing people like what together we can win could be really helpful. And I'll let the others take the rest of the.
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about what went down with AFSCME. So in Tallahassee, because Tallahassee is all public sector unions, so we had 4 AFSCME chapters. One, which was the state workers, which was a bargaining unit of about 13,000. Now, that doesn't mean we had 13,000 members, but it was a bargaining unit of about 13,000. Then we had the AFSCME chapter at Florida State, and then the AFSCME chapter at Florida A&M University, and then the AFSCME chapter for the state hospital, which was slightly out of town. The most organized one of those was the Florida A&M chapter. But, so out of those 4, you're talking 4 big locals. In Tallahassee, AFSCME had 1 organizing staffer who wasn't even always permanently in Tallahassee, that split time in Jacksonville and across the state. So you're talking about, an impossible task. And so like when I was with AFSCME of the state, we were under receivership, and then we finally gained back, and we had our executive committee, and I was the first active steward in Tallahassee in a decade. So for a bargaining unit of 13,000, we had about 300 members. We collectively got it up to about 500 or so. But when we came down to the 60% thing, when that came down the pipe, it was nothing. And AFSCME just left. Now, Florida A&M was the most well organized of them, and they probably maybe would have struggled to get to 60%, but they could have done the card campaign and kept their union, but AFSCME again just kind of left. They are reorganizing, like I alluded to. They are reorganizing under the UCW, CWA, United Campus Workers, which is a wall-to-wall union, at least for staff, in a way that they weren't before. They're organizing at least right now, as a pre-majority union. But if we know anything about FAMU, the administration doesn't bargain with the unions anyways. They refuse to bargain, or when they do bargain, they schedule a time and they don't show up to the bargaining table. They'll just send a text like, "Oh, our bad, we forgot." So all that is happening. The one really real time at FAMU that we had success with AFSCME was when the unions came together, when we got people from the Leon Classroom Teachers Association, when we got people from Florida State faculty, FAMU faculty, and we all put on AFSCME shirts, and we stood in front of the board of directors, and we said, "You got to bargain, and you got to give them a raise." And that year, they actually got a raise. I think, Josh, were you there? Oh, Josh was there. Yeah, we actually got a raise that one year. So maybe with the UCW, even if they don't have contractual bargaining, if we can stand there and support them and make them, in a political manner, maybe force them to give them a raise, maybe that's how this is done.
All right. What else? I'm going to ask Kit a question, and I'm combining a couple here, and then we'll turn to the brother at TWU and come back to a couple more here. So combining somewhat, does the emergence of American Compass signal a possible fissure in the right-wing think tank universe that progressives can exploit? And along that, how does this Orencast American Compass labor project relate to the neo-reactionary Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, Mark Andreessen dynamic that's driving the administration?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's something that's on my mind. Right? Are there cracks that can be exploited? I think. I mean, it's always good to see your enemies fight amongst themselves. I think the part that seems perhaps the part that I think I find most worrisome, I'll start with that and I'll end with something positive. But the part that I find more worrisome is already seeing certain figures, certainly coming out of the labor movement, kind of flirting with this vision of, well, maybe we're not getting anywhere with labor law reform via the Democrats. Politically speaking, electorally, that kind of frustration is precisely what Cass and others in that universe are themselves eager to exploit, right? They want to split the organized labor movement from the Democratic Party. And one figure who I've done a bit of research about is former SEIU Local 775 President David Rolfe. Has engaged in very friendly debates with Orrin Cass about the future of collective bargaining. I think he's now listed on their website as one of their advisors. So there are figures like that seeing like, well, maybe we can get something out of, should NLRB-style collective bargaining rights be overturned, maybe we can find something there to work with. And so that's worrisome, I think, to see these overtures as and to sort of negotiate on the same terms that somebody like Cass is putting forward. Now, the other side of that coin might be that, as I said, I think in my presentation, that I think the fact that someone like Cass is putting forward these ideas, I think betrays, again, a nervousness, a concern that these, the existing ensemble of ideas and forces perhaps isn't enough to reproduce precisely what they want to see. So I think that might be the area to exploit and to keep pushing, not within their vein of what cooperative bargaining might look like or what they think it means to give workers a seat at the table, but instead to keep pushing to force the issue, and if anything, to force these tensions within, say the case of the U.S. right, to fissure ever further. As far as the Elon Musk. I think they seem to be, my sense was that they would be quite hostile to the kind of reforms put forward by somebody like Cass. They're not particularly interested in giving workers a seat at the table, no matter how, symbolically or figuratively. The case of what, I think as my other panelists were pointing out about what, public sector collective bargaining now looks like in Florida, seems like something more in line with what Cass and those at American Compass would like to see generalized. And I can't see that quite fitting into the same sort of techno-fascism that Musk, Thiel, and others like that are pushing forward.
All right, I'll let you hand the mic down to.
I wasn't going to say anything, but you mentioned the Democratic Party. I think we need to teach the Democratic Party to stop having Fannie Lou Hamer moments. You had one this last convention. You didn't let the Palestinians speak. There goes the election, period. And too many of you guys didn't say anything. But back to the point, I see here educators in a union. In New York, well, I don't know what it says in the Florida Constitution, but it says in our Constitution, you got to teach the truth up here in New York. So teach the truth. You're just teaching the truth. You're just following the Constitution. That should be an organizing thing. My mother was a teacher in a union. We were a union household. There was a year and a half I didn't eat grapes because the grapes were on strike. What are you guys doing about that to educate your neighbors? Hey, like if the person that sweeps the floor is having a problem, and you're a union, you need to find a way to subversively support them. I mean, another thing, young kids now, they do everything by an app. Well, okay, you got an app for this, an app for that to pay for. Well, you can get an app to pay your union dues. Like that's what it means when it comes out of your check. In the TWU, we have something called the shit bus. Basically, that's what you got to do. You got to educate your people. You got young people that are not thinking. Stop being selfish. Because when the guy that makes the tires gets hurt, you get flats while you're going down the highway. You get stuck and especially in Florida, you get stuck in the middle of the Everglades. The goddamn alligator's going to eat your ass. You need to talk like that. I don't hear that union spirit here. You can't self-castrate yourself by supporting a Republican. You're cutting the thing off, man. You ain't getting no pleasure. You understand what I'm saying? I don't hear that. I mean, I had a subversive history teacher. God bless her soul. we had to read the Soviet Union's constitution. Couldn't find it. She gave us a copy, and the assignment was this: check out the United States Constitution at the time in 1918. How much rights did women have? But look what it says in the Soviet Constitution. I'm not talking about this bullshit Russia right now. Excuse the French. But that Constitution, we said we're in the wrong country, being a black person, because they said no racism in there 5 times. 1918. And in your state, you got a real crap governor. He basically summarily pardoned one of the Groveland Four. You know that case? You're an educator. You know that case? Those are men that, you read up on it. 4 men lynched, basically lynched through the court system, and the sheriff basically shot 2 of them. And the FBI said, well, wait a minute. They were running away, but all the bullets in the ground, okay? But the bottom line is he pardoned them after their death, but now he's got the thing where he don't want to teach about it. And by the way, they were on one side of town, of Groveland, and they were on the other side. So, do some subversive teaching in the class and among your union. You should know that as an educator, which means you teach them. Okay, you shook your head yes. Teach him on the way home. Okay? I'm dead serious. No more Joe the plumber. You know the Joe the plumber? Remember him? Well, auto workers got a Joe the plumber at the White House. That's bull crap. That's bull crap. Okay? How are we going to stop Joe the plumber? Because that's what's happening to your union. You got Joe the plumber running around supporting the Republicans. That's anti-union, right? So help me out here.
And so maybe a good segue as we're getting into the last 5 minutes here. Another, echoing the questions the brother raised, has there been a response from parents and communities? Has there been effective outreach about impacts of what's happening? What are you seeing on the ground?
I can only speak on my campus. I'm at the University of Central Florida. Parents, I'm not sure. I don't see a lot of parents who are kind of taking or publicly responding in the ways I think that would be helpful for us. But I do see students. And students are engaged. Especially when it's around questions of academic freedom, because, and this is something I talk about with a lot of students. I can kind of get them agitated by entering a dialogue about this. But, the attacks on academic freedom towards us are really about them more than it is about us, right? Because lawmakers believe that students are just these empty receptacles, and that they're really not that smart, and they can be indoctrinated and things like this. And so when I talk to students and young people, I mention this. I go, what do you think about this? What do you think about the idea that we can't, teach you these concepts, without feeling a sense of intimidation by our supervisors? And they get, when they start thinking about that, they really heated up about that. And I'll tell you one story, and I'll stop here. But I should mention this kind of response to you. What do we do? Katie and I are both plaintiffs on lawsuits that are challenging our, not same lawsuit, different lawsuits, different laws too, but that are challenging these threats to academic freedom. I did mine I think a year or two before hers, and so in that time, I was, and I still am, a plaintiff on one of the Stop Woke Acts, right, with DeSantis. And so this student wandered into my office. She was a young woman who was on the Student Government Association. And she just wandered in my office, and she says, "You, Dr. Castanello?" And I said, "Yeah, what can I do for you?" She goes, "No, I just wanted to see who you were." And I was kind of taken back by it. I go, "Oh, why is this?" She's like, "I read about you in the news, and I read that you have a lawsuit against DeSantis and Stop Woke, and I really appreciate that. And I want to know, what can I do? And I had the conversation that I just said with her about how does it make you feel? What does it say about you and this kind of stuff? And she's like, well, what can I do? And I go, well, you're on student government, right? And she's like, yeah. I go, well, have you thought about passing a resolution, right? And she goes, no, I haven't, but let me bring it back to my colleagues or whatever. And I didn't hear from her again for like 8 or 9 months. And then she reached out to me and she said, what are you doing next Thursday at like 6 p.m.? I go, nothing. Why? She's like, can you come to student government? And I went to student government, and they unanimously passed a resolution condemning DeSantis, condemning Stop Woke, and taking upon themselves saying, we are not morons. We are not idiots. We are at the center of our education, and we reject the idea that you lawmakers can tell us what we can learn. I mean, this was all in the resolution, and it was, I think my proudest moment at UCF to see that. And like I said, I hadn't heard from the student. I just said that, comment, and I didn't realize I was planting a seed. But these students really kind of took it upon themselves, and the news covered it and things like this. So, I mean, there are ways to kind of get young people involved in these things if we have those conversations.
So there are more questions here that I'd love to get to, but we are about at 30 seconds out. So to wrap it up, come on up if folks want to chat. But so everyone's aware, the next session starts at 1:45. Here will be strikes as social and political tools. On the 14th floor will be labor organizing and cross-national perspectives. There'll be boxed lunches out here, so folks can stay on this floor, go outside, go down to the 14th floor. Take a break, but want to, again, give a round of applause to our panelists. This was a really great discussion, and look forward to the rest of the day.